The desert sun burned mercilessly overhead as the convoy of military vehicles rolled through the dusty streets of a small Afghan village. Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Martinez adjusted his tactical gear and checked his weapon for the third time that morning. His SEAL team had been deployed to this remote area following intelligence reports of enemy activity in the region. The mission seemed routine at first. They were tasked with providing security for a medical outreach program that would serve the local population. The Navy had partnered with international aid organizations to bring much-needed healthcare to civilians caught in the crossfire of ongoing conflicts. For seasoned operators like Martinez and his team, this was considered a relatively safe assignment compared to their usual high-risk operations. As their vehicle came to a stop near the makeshift medical station, Martinez noticed a woman sitting alone on a wooden crate near the entrance. She appeared to be in her early 30s, wearing traditional Afghan clothing that had seen better days. Her dark hair was partially covered by a worn headscarf, and she clutched a small bundle in her arms. What struck Martinez immediately was her posture. Despite the chaos around her, with children running and adults chattering in various languages, she sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with an expression that seemed carved from stone. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Sarah Chen, was already setting up triage stations when she noticed the woman as well. Chen had served 3 deployments and had seen her share of trauma victims, but something about this particular woman caught her attention. The woman's eyes held a depth of pain that Chen recognized from her years of treating combat veterans, yet there was also a strength there that commanded respect. "Chief, you see that woman over there?" Chen asked Martinez quietly as she organized her medical supplies. Martinez glanced over at the silent figure. "Yeah, I noticed her too. Something seems off. She hasn't moved since we arrived." The medical outreach program began in earnest as the sun climbed higher. Local families started forming lines for basic healthcare services, vaccinations, and treatment for various ailments. Children laughed and played nearby, while their parents waited patiently. The SEAL team maintained security perimeters, while the medical staff worked diligently to serve as many people as possible. Hours passed, and the silent woman remained in the same position. She had not joined any of the lines for medical care, nor had she interacted with anyone around her. The bundle in her arms never moved, and she never looked down at it. Chen found herself glancing over at the woman repeatedly throughout the morning, growing more concerned with each passing hour. During a brief break, Chen approached the woman slowly and respectfully. She had learned enough of the local language during her deployments to communicate basic medical needs. As she drew closer, she could see that the woman's hands were shaking slightly, though her face remained expressionless. "Are you hurt?" Chen asked gently, in broken Dari, the local language. "Do you need help?" The woman's eyes moved to meet Chen's for the first time, and what the medic saw there made her breath catch in her throat. The woman's eyes were filled with such profound grief and trauma that Chen had to steady herself. Yet the woman said nothing. She simply looked at Chen for a long moment, before turning her gaze back to the distance. Chen noticed that the woman's clothing, while modest and traditional, bore stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The bundle in her arms was wrapped in what appeared to be a small blanket, and Chen's medical training began to raise alarm bells in her mind. She had seen enough battlefield casualties to recognize the signs of recent trauma. "Martinez," Chen called quietly to her team leader, never taking her eyes off the woman. "I think we might have a problem here." The Master Chief made his way over, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation. He had been in enough combat zones to recognize when someone was in shock or experiencing severe psychological trauma. The woman's stillness was not peaceful. It was the kind of frozen state that people entered when their minds could no longer process the horror they had experienced. Other members of the SEAL team began to take notice as well. Petty Officer First Class David Rodriguez, the team's senior enlisted advisor, had been observing the crowd when he spotted Chen and Martinez, focused on the silent woman. Rodriguez had spent years in special operations and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong in any given situation. "What's the situation, Chief?" Rodriguez asked, as he joined the small group. "Not sure yet," Martinez replied quietly. "But our medic thinks something's not right with this woman." As the afternoon wore on, the medical team began to wind down their operations. Most of the local families had been seen and treated, and the SEAL team was preparing for their departure. However, the silent woman had not moved from her position, and Chen's concern had grown into genuine alarm. Chen decided to make one more attempt to communicate with the woman. This time, she brought along Sergeant First Class Ahmad Khalil, an Afghan-American interpreter who had been working with coalition forces for several years. Khalil was known for his ability to communicate with traumatized civilians and had helped many families during his time serving alongside American forces. "Ma'am," Khalil said gently in perfect Dari, kneeling down to the woman's eye level. "We are here to help. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" For the first time since the team had arrived, the woman responded. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her words came out in broken fragments. Khalil listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave as he tried to piece together what she was telling him. "What is she saying?" Chen asked urgently. Khalil held up a hand, asking for patience as he continued to listen to the woman's fragmented account. The woman's voice grew slightly stronger as she spoke, though her body remained rigid and her eyes continued to stare into the distance. After several minutes, Khalil stood up slowly, his face pale despite his years of experience dealing with civilian casualties. He motioned for Chen and Martinez to step away from the woman so they could speak privately. "Chief," Khalil began, his voice heavy with emotion. "What she's telling me, it's worse than we thought. Much worse." Martinez felt his stomach tighten. In his years of service, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him that they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple medical case. "Give me the details," Martinez said quietly, positioning himself so he could keep the woman in his peripheral vision while listening to Khalil's translation. "She says her village was attacked 3 days ago," Khalil began, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was reporting. "She managed to escape, but—" He paused, looking back at the woman with obvious compassion. "But what?" Chen pressed, though part of her already suspected what she was about to hear. "The bundle she's carrying," Khalil said quietly. "It's not what we think it is. She's been carrying it for 3 days, and she won't let go of it because—" He took a deep breath before continuing. "Because it's all she has left of her family." Chen felt her knees go weak as the full implications of Khalil's words hit her. The bundle that the woman had been clutching for hours was not a possession or even an injured animal, as some of the team had speculated. The woman had been carrying the body of her young child for 3 days, unable to process the trauma enough to understand that her child was gone. Martinez immediately understood the gravity of the situation. This was not just a medical emergency. It was a humanitarian crisis that required immediate and careful handling. The woman was clearly in severe psychological shock and needed specialized care that went far beyond what their field medical capabilities could provide. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered when Martinez quietly briefed him on the situation. 3 days? The entire SEAL team had paused their departure preparations as word of the woman's situation spread through their ranks. These were hardened warriors who had seen combat in some of the world's most dangerous places, but the sight of a mother who had been carrying her deceased child for days without understanding what had happened struck them all to their core. Chen knelt down beside the woman again, this time with a different understanding of what she was dealing with. The woman's silence was not defiance or confusion. It was the mind's way of protecting itself from a reality too horrible to accept. The medic had seen similar cases during her deployments, though none quite as heartbreaking as this one. "We need to handle this very carefully," Chen told Martinez. "She's in severe psychological shock, and any sudden movement or attempt to take the bundle away from her could cause a complete breakdown." Martinez nodded grimly. He had already begun formulating a plan that would require delicate coordination between his team, the medical staff, and the local authorities. This woman needed help that went far beyond what they could provide in a field setting, but they also could not simply walk away from someone in such desperate need. As the sun began to set over the Afghan landscape, the SEAL team found themselves facing a situation that no amount of military training had prepared them for. The silent woman continued to sit motionless, clutching her tragic burden, while around her a group of elite warriors struggled to find a way to help someone whose world had been completely shattered. The mission parameters had changed completely. What had started as a routine security operation for a medical outreach program had become something much more complex and emotionally challenging. The team realized that sometimes the most important battles were not fought with weapons, but with compassion and understanding in the face of unimaginable human suffering. The evening air brought little relief from the day's heat, as Master Chief Martinez coordinated with his chain of command via encrypted communications. The situation with the silent woman had escalated beyond a simple humanitarian concern and now required careful navigation through military protocols and international humanitarian law. The woman, whose name they had learned was Fatima, continued to sit in the same position as darkness began to fall over the village. Chen had managed to establish a fragile connection with Fatima through Khalil's patient translation work. The medic learned that Fatima had been a schoolteacher in her village before the attack. She had been educated, spoke multiple languages, and had been working to establish a small school for local children when insurgents had swept through her community 3 days earlier. The attack had been swift and brutal. Fatima had been in her home with her 5-year-old son, Amir, when the shooting began. In the chaos that followed, her husband had been killed while trying to protect other villagers, and her son had been struck by shrapnel from an explosive device. Fatima had gathered Amir in her arms and fled into the desert, not understanding at first that her child had already died from his wounds. She kept walking for 2 days. Khalil, translated as Fatima, spoke in broken whispers. She thought he was sleeping. She said she didn't want to wake him because he seemed so peaceful. The psychological defense mechanism that had protected Fatima's mind from accepting her son's death was beginning to crack as she spoke with the medical team. Chen could see the awareness starting to creep into the woman's eyes, and she knew they were approaching a critical moment where Fatima would either begin to process her grief or potentially suffer a complete psychological breakdown. Rodriguez had established a secure perimeter around the area where Fatima sat, not to contain her but to ensure her privacy and dignity during this incredibly vulnerable time. The other SEALs maintained their professional demeanor, but each man was deeply affected by the situation. Many of them were fathers themselves, and the sight of a mother's unbearable loss resonated with them on a personal level. Petty Officer Second Class Michael Thompson, the team's youngest member, found himself particularly moved by Fatima's story. Thompson had joined the SEALs partly because he wanted to make a difference in the world, to help protect innocent people from exactly the kind of violence that had destroyed Fatima's life. Now he was confronted with the stark reality that sometimes they arrived too late, and sometimes the damage was too profound for any military intervention to undo. "Chief," Thompson approached Martinez during a brief tactical discussion. "What happens to her after this? I mean, even if we get her help, she's lost everything." Martinez appreciated the young SEAL's concern, but he also recognized the danger of becoming too emotionally invested in situations that were beyond their control. "Our job is to get her the immediate help she needs," he replied. "Beyond that, there are other agencies and organizations better equipped to provide long-term support." However, even as he said the words, Martinez found himself thinking about his own children back home and wondering what he would do in Fatima's position. The professional distance that was crucial for effective military operations was being challenged by the very human tragedy playing out before them. Chen had been working throughout the evening to coordinate with medical evacuation resources and psychological trauma specialists. The nearest facility equipped to handle Fatima's condition was several hours away, and arranging transportation would require navigating complex logistics and security considerations. "We need to move her tonight," Chen told Martinez during their evening briefing. "Her psychological state is deteriorating, and the longer she holds on to." Chen paused, unable to find the right words for the tragic burden Fatima carried. "I understand," Martinez replied. "I've already initiated the evacuation process, but it's going to take time to coordinate all the moving pieces." As the team prepared for what would likely be a long night, Khalil continued his patient work with Fatima. The interpreter had experience with trauma victims, but Fatima's case was testing even his considerable skills. He knew that pushing her too hard to confront reality could be dangerous, but he also understood that she needed to begin processing her grief if she was going to have any chance of psychological recovery. "Fatima," Khalil said gently, sitting beside her as the stars became visible overhead, "the American doctors want to help you. They have medicine that can help with the pain you're feeling. Fatima's response was barely audible. Amir needs medicine too, she whispered. He has been sleeping for so long. I think he might be sick. Khalil's heart broke as he realized that Fatima was still not ready to accept the truth about her son's condition. He looked over at Chen, who was monitoring the conversation carefully, and shook his head slightly. The woman's mind was still protecting itself from a reality too painful to bear. The evacuation helicopter finally arrived near midnight, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and noise that added to the surreal atmosphere of the situation. The aircraft carried a specialized medical team, including a psychiatrist who had experience treating severe trauma cases in combat zones. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the psychiatrist, approached the situation with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that one wrong move could shatter what remained of Fatima's fragile psychological state. She had worked with civilian casualties throughout her deployment and had developed techniques for helping people process unimaginable loss. Has she shown any signs of accepting reality? Dr. Morrison asked Chen, as they prepared to approach Fatima together. No, Chen replied honestly. If anything, she seems to be retreating further into the protective delusion. She's been talking about her son as if he's just sleeping, and she's expressed concern about him being cold or needing medicine. Dr. Morrison nodded gravely. She had seen similar cases before, though none quite as prolonged or severe as Fatima's situation. The fact that the woman had been carrying her deceased child for 3 days, while believing he was merely sleeping, indicated a level of psychological trauma that would require intensive and careful treatment. The process of convincing Fatima to board the helicopter took nearly an hour. She was initially resistant to leaving the area where she had been sitting, partly because she feared it would disturb Amir's sleep, and partly because moving represented a change that her traumatized mind could not easily process. Khalil served as the primary communicator throughout the delicate negotiation. He explained that the helicopter would take both Fatima and Amir to a place where they could rest more comfortably, and where Amir could receive proper medical attention. The key was framing the evacuation in terms that Fatima's protective delusion could accept. She wants to know if Amir will be warm enough on the helicopter, Khalil translated. She's worried about the wind. Tell her we have blankets, Dr. Morrison replied, fighting back her own emotional response to the woman's heartbreaking concern for her deceased child. Tell her that we'll make sure both of them are comfortable. As Fatima was gently guided toward the helicopter, the entire SEAL team stood in respectful silence. These warriors had faced enemy fire, explosive devices, and life-threatening situations throughout their careers, but watching a grieving mother's careful protection of her child's body was perhaps the most emotionally challenging experience any of them had encountered. Rodriguez found himself thinking about his own family and the randomness of violence that could destroy innocent lives in an instant. There, but for the grace of God, he murmured to Thompson as they watched the helicopter lift off into the night sky. The aircraft disappeared into the darkness, carrying Fatima toward what everyone hoped would be the beginning of a long and difficult healing process. The SEAL team was left to pack up their equipment and prepare for their own departure, but the weight of what they had witnessed would stay with each of them long after the mission was officially completed. Chen found herself questioning whether they had done enough for Fatima. The medic understood that their intervention had likely saved the woman's life, and had certainly connected her with the specialized care she desperately needed, but she also knew that the road ahead for Fatima would be incredibly difficult. Do you think she'll make it? Thompson asked Chen, as they loaded their medical supplies. Chen considered the question carefully before answering. The human spirit is incredibly resilient, she said finally. But she's going to need more help than any of us can provide. The good news is that she's now connected with people who specialize in exactly this kind of trauma. Aldese, Martinez completed his after-action reports as the team prepared to leave the area. The official documentation would capture the basic facts of their encounter with Fatima, but he knew that no written report could adequately convey the emotional impact of the situation or the profound way it had affected each member of his team. As their convoy pulled away from the village in the early morning hours, the SEALs carried with them a deeper understanding of the true costs of warfare. They had seen how violence rippled outward from its immediate targets, destroying not just lives but the very fabric of human connection and hope. The silent woman who had captured their attention and commanded their respect was now beginning a journey toward healing that would test every resource available to help her. Her story had reminded them all that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in tactical objectives achieved, but in individual lives touched and preserved in the face of overwhelming tragedy. 6 months after the encounter with Fatima, Master Chief Martinez found himself stationed at Naval Base San Diego, processing the psychological aftermath of multiple deployments. The image of the silent woman carrying her deceased child had haunted him and his team members in ways that typical combat experiences had not. It was during a routine meeting with military mental health counselors that Martinez first learned about the long-term impact their intervention had made in Fatima's life. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the psychiatrist who had treated Fatima during the evacuation, had maintained contact with the medical team that continued her care. The initial weeks of Fatima's treatment had been touch and go, with moments where it seemed she might never emerge from her protective psychological shell. However, with patient care and specialized therapy designed for severe trauma victims, Fatima had gradually begun to accept the reality of her son's death and her own survival. The breakthrough came about 3 weeks after the evacuation. Dr. Morrison explained during a video conference with Martinez and his team. She finally asked to hold Amir properly, to say goodbye to him. It was heartbreaking, but it was also the beginning of her healing process. Chen, who had been promoted and was now serving at a different base, joined the call remotely. The medic had struggled with her own emotional response to Fatima's case and had sought counseling to process the experience. "How is she doing now?" Chen asked, her voice reflecting the genuine concern she still carried for the woman they had encountered in the Afghan village. "Better than we initially hoped," Dr. Morrison replied. "The healing process for this level of trauma is measured in years, not months. But she's making remarkable progress. She's even begun talking about her memories of Amir in positive terms, sharing stories about his personality and the things they used to do together." The news brought a sense of relief to the SEAL team members who had been affected by Fatima's story. Rodriguez, who had recently returned from another deployment, felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Is she safe now? Does she have somewhere to go?" Dr. Morrison smiled for the first time during the call. "Actually, that's one of the most positive developments. There's a refugee resettlement program that has accepted her case. She's being relocated to a community in the United States where there's a strong support network of other Afghan refugees. She'll have access to continued psychological care and educational opportunities." Thompson, who had been the most emotionally affected by Fatima's situation, asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Does she remember us? Does she know that we tried to help her?" "She remembers everything, Doctor," Morrison replied. "In fact, she specifically asked me to thank the soldiers who found her that day. She said that if you hadn't stopped and noticed her, she doesn't think she would have survived much longer." The revelation that Fatima remembered their encounter and was grateful for their intervention provided a sense of closure that none of the team members had expected. They had operated under the assumption that their role in her recovery was minimal, simply connecting her with more qualified help. Learning that their compassion and attention had been meaningful to her healing process gave new perspective to their military service. Martinez had been promoted to senior chief and was now responsible for training younger SEALs in both tactical operations and the psychological realities of modern warfare. Fatima's story had become part of his teaching curriculum, not as a tale of military heroics, but as an example of how warriors could make a difference through simple human decency and attention to civilian suffering. "You'll encounter situations in the field that aren't covered in any manual," Martinez told a group of newly graduated SEALs during a training session. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply notice when someone needs help and care enough to act on that observation." The young SEALs listened intently as Martinez described the encounter with Fatima, though he was careful to protect her privacy by changing identifying details. The story served as a powerful reminder that their training in combat operations needed to be balanced with an understanding of their role as protectors of innocent civilians. Chen had used her experience with Fatima to pursue additional training in combat psychology and trauma treatment. She had become an advocate within the Navy Medical Corps for better preparation in dealing with civilian trauma victims during overseas deployments. "We train extensively for treating military casualties," she told her colleagues during a medical conference. but we need to be equally prepared for the psychological trauma we might encounter in civilian populations. The ripple effects of that day in Afghanistan continued to influence the careers and perspectives of everyone involved. Khalil, the interpreter, had eventually immigrated to the United States and was working with veteran support organizations to help former military personnel process their overseas experiences. His work with Fatima had shown him the powerful healing potential of patient, compassionate communication. 1 year after the initial encounter, Martinez received an unexpected letter forwarded through military channels. The return address indicated it was from a refugee resettlement organization in Michigan. But he didn't immediately realize the significance until he began reading the carefully written English text. "Dear Master Chief Martinez and your team," the letter began. "My name is Fatima Ahmadi, and you may remember meeting me in Afghanistan. I wanted to write to tell you about my life now, and to thank you for saving me when I could not save myself." Martinez sat down heavily as he continued reading. Fatima's letter described her new life in America, where she was attending English classes and working toward certification to teach in American schools. She had found a community of other Afghan refugees who provided support and understanding for the trauma she had experienced. "I think about Amir every day," the letter continued. "But now I can think about the happy memories too, not just the sadness. The doctors tell me this is because I was able to get help when I needed it most. I know that without your kindness, I would not have lived to write this letter." The letter went on to describe how Fatima had connected with other mothers who had lost children to violence, and how she was working to establish a support group for refugee women dealing with similar trauma. "Amir's memory lives on through the help I can give to other mothers," she wrote. "This gives meaning to our suffering." Martinez immediately shared the letter with his former team members, and the response was overwhelming. Rodriguez called to say he had tears in his eyes reading about Fatima's recovery. Thompson, who was now married with a young child of his own, said the letter reminded him why he had chosen military service in the first place. Chen was perhaps the most moved by Fatima's message. "She's turned her own healing into a way to help others," the medic told Martinez during a phone call. "That's exactly the kind of strength I saw in her eyes that day, even when she was at her lowest point." 2 years after the initial encounter, Dr. Morrison invited Martinez to attend a conference on trauma recovery, where Fatima was scheduled to speak about her experience. The former schoolteacher had become an advocate for refugee mental health services and was working to bridge the gap between military operations and civilian support services. Martinez was nervous about seeing Fatima again, uncertain how she would react to being reminded of the darkest period of her life. However, when they were introduced at the conference, Fatima's response was immediate and warm. She embraced the gruff Master Chief with genuine affection, speaking to him in the English she had worked so hard to learn. "You were the first person to see me as more than a victim," Fatima told him. "You saw me as a mother who needed help, and that recognition saved my life." During her presentation to the conference attendees, Fatima spoke eloquently about the importance of treating trauma victims with dignity and patience. "The soldiers who found me did not try to force me to accept reality before I was ready," she explained. "They protected my dignity while getting me the help I needed. This is how healing begins." The audience, which included military personnel, medical professionals, and refugee advocates, listened in respectful silence as Fatima described her journey from devastating loss to purposeful recovery. Her story had become a powerful example of how individual acts of compassion could create far-reaching positive change. Martinez left the conference with a renewed sense of purpose in his military career. The encounter with Fatima had taught him that the most important battles weren't always fought against identifiable enemies, but sometimes against despair, trauma, and the forces that sought to destroy human dignity and hope. The silent woman who had once sat motionless in an Afghan village, carrying an unbearable burden, had transformed her suffering into a source of strength that now helped others heal from similar trauma. Her journey from victim to survivor to advocate demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact that simple acts of compassion could have in the darkest of circumstances. The SEAL team's encounter with Fatima had lasted only a few hours, but its effects continued to ripple outward, influencing military training protocols, medical procedures, and the lives of everyone involved. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most heroic acts involve not violence, but the courage to respond to suffering with kindness and the determination to ensure that no one faced their darkest moments alone. In the end, Fatima's story became more than just an account of tragedy and recovery. It became a testament to the power of human connection and the possibility of finding meaning and purpose even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. The silent woman had found her voice again, and she was using it to help others find theirs.